morning. Good morning. We love each of you, and we're glad to see that you're able to be with us this Lord's Day. There was a young man who was struggling in his life with drugs. And a friend of his was trying to help him out, and he got him a job working at a factory. And early on, he made plans to go pick him up at his house, to take him to work. And he got there and he found out that his friend had had a relapse. Had done cocaine the night before, drank a lot of whiskey, and he certainly was not in any shape to get up and go to work. But the friend helped him out, and he took him to work. And the first thing they did was they went to his immediate supervisor. And she could just take one look at him and see that something was wrong. Now, all the way there, the one struggling with drugs kept asking his other friend, "What am I going to do? What am I going to say?" And his friend says, "You just need to tell the truth." And so when the supervisor saw him, she said, "What happened last night? What happened?" He said, "I got stoned last night. I fell down." Now, he was expecting to get fired. And if you were his boss, maybe you would have fired him. Maybe I would have fired him. But she gave him a response that we might say is something that could have come straight from the heart of God. She said, "We're all family here." She said, "I'm also a recovering alcoholic. Go home and sleep. Come back tomorrow." The friend took him to the owner to talk to the owner as well. And the owner also asked what had happened. And the man told the owner the truth as well. The owner took the man by the hand, had a prayer that God would strengthen him, and told him to go home and go to sleep. Now, what that man expected was justice. If you can't be responsible, go find some other work. I can't depend on it. What he got was mercy. Do you live a good life? What is a good life? Psalms 103, and I hope you open your Bibles there because we're going to read the text and meditate on that this morning. If you're using the Bible in the pew, it's page 502. Psalms 103 is identified as being a psalm written by King David. Did David live a good life? We know that David was guilty of the big sins, we would say, murder and adultery. But David identifies in 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 2 that the words that he spoke and the songs that he wrote were not his own. They were guided by the Holy Spirit. And so thankfully, the things that David wrote are at a higher level than how he lived. Most of us would say, we tell our children, don't do as I do, do as I say. Because we know we don't live up to our own expectations. David, that was really true. Because what he wrote and what he said came from the Spirit of God. And so David is able to encourage us here in Psalms 103 to live the good life. A life that he himself strived to live, but obviously he fell short. But he tells us the answer. He tells us the solution to living a good life here in Psalms 103. And I want us to meditate on this psalm this morning. The good life. You'll notice the first thing when you read Psalms 103, what the words number 4, 5, and 6. Bless my Lord, O my soul. David's getting on a conversation with himself. How many times I am trying to emphasize to us when we're going through hard times in our lives, when we're discouraged, when we're depressed, when we have a negative mindset, when we're feeling pessimistic, we have to talk to ourselves. And we have to talk ourselves out of those negative feelings. Because if we are Christians, we have every reason to be optimistic and be faithful. And that's what David talks about here in these 22 verses. David has a conversation with himself. And he says, here is how I need to live the good life. So first of all, when we look at verses 1 and 2, we see that David says the good life revolves around worshiping God. Do you remember last week when I gave you this quotation? Missions is not the ultimate goal of our lives. Missions is not the ultimate goal. Evangelism is not the ultimate goal. Worship is. Mission or evangelism exists because worship does not. You and I are worshiping beings. Jesus tells us in John chapter 4 that God is looking for true worshipers. What that implies is that everybody is a worshiper. We all worship something or somebody. You show me what is the ultimate motivation in a person's life, and I'll tell you what they worship. Here David says, my life revolves around worshiping God. Notice what he says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless His holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget none of His benefits. David's life truly revolved around worshiping God. And in fact, the majority of these Psalms, as we all know, were written by David. David was a poet, and he created that poetry into songs and praise to God. David's life revolved around worship. And if we want to live the good life, then we need to make sure that our lives revolve around worshiping God. Notice how comprehensive David looks at worship affecting his being. Let all that is within me worship God. There's a song leader in the Nashville area who led singing and gospel meetings and things like that. Very well-known song leader. He actually sang for the Jordanaires, who were backup singers for Elvis Presley. But he is a member of the Church of Christ, Ray Walker. And my parents have some tapes where he led singing in congregations in the Nashville area, and some of them he would do a little talking. And on one occasion, I remember he said that he believed that Christians ought to leave worship worn out. He said we ought to leave worship tired because we have put all of our being into worship. And I think that's what David is saying here. Let all of my being, let my mind, let my heart, let my will, let my emotions engage in worship to God. Now you think about how that would impact our lives, Sunday through Saturday, if our whole being was involved in worshiping God. Certainly not just on Sunday, but worshiping God through prayer, through Bible study and singing, meditating on God and His nature. And we're going to talk about that as we look through the rest of the psalm. All through the week. David says, I want to bless His holy name. David recognized, he'd be the first to recognize that he himself was not holy. But God is total holiness. He's total purity. And David recognized that if I'm going to rise above these sins that I've committed, I've got to come in contact with that holy nature. Now, you and I can do that in the way that David could not, because we live on this side of Jesus giving his life on the cross. But the holiness of God was something that David reflected on, and it helped motivate him to engage in worship. And so point number one as we look through this psalm is that the good life revolves around worshiping God. And I hope that your life revolves around worshiping God. But notice in verses 3 through 5 how David describes God. Why worship God? Why worship God? Notice how he describes God. In the New American Standard and the English Standard, these next several phrases in verses 3 through 5 begin with who. Who is God? Why should I worship Him? Notice what he says in verse 3. Who pardons all of your iniquities? Who heals all your diseases? Who redeems your life from the pit? Who crowns you with loving kindness and compassion? And if you're the kind of Bible student who underlines in your Bible, underline loving kindness there. And see how many times he mentions the loving kindness of God in this psalm. Verse 5, who satisfies your years with good things, so that your youth is renewed like the eagle. Look at how David describes God. Why should I worship God? David says, you will live a good life if you reflect on the blessings that God gives you. And the first blessing that David mentions is the murder that I committed, the adultery I committed. I'm not proud of that. But God pardons all my iniquities. The foundation of our relationship with God is forgiveness. Where God says, you know what? The sins that you've committed that are keeping you away from me, I'm going to forgive them. I'm going to wipe them out. I'm not going to remember them anymore. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. And I will allow you to come into my presence. Enjoy fellowship. Why worship God? David says, because He heals your diseases. All healing comes from God. All healing is a blessing from God. Now, sometimes we understand that God says, I'm not going to heal you of your disease. I'm going to let it take its course. But I want you to trust Him. I will be with you even in the diseases that you struggle with. Because I want you to depend on me. I don't want you to depend on the doctors. I don't want you to depend on the medication you take. I don't want you to depend on your diet. I don't want you to depend on exercise. I want you to depend on me. All healing comes from God. And so we as Christians understand that through it all, God knows what is best for us. God knows what's best. And if it's best for me to struggle, God says, I know what's best for me. And if it's best for me to God to heal me, God knows what's best for me. The good life reflects on God's blessings to us. David says that God redeems his life from the pit. That is, bad things that happen to me, God is going to be there to pull me out. When I fall into the pit of discouragement, God is there to pull me out. When I fall into the pit of temptation, God is there to pull me out. When I fall into the pit of sin, God is there to pull me out. God is there to rescue us. Sometimes God is there to save us from our own foolish decisions that could end up in being self-destructive. And God saves us from that. The good life reflects on the blessings of God. He crowns us with loving kindness and compassion. What would you love to be crowned with? So many people out there want to be crowned with gold or silver. But what better thing to have placed on our heads than God's loving kindness and His compassion? That's what sets us apart. That's what raises us up. Back in the days of the monarchy, there's a few monarchies in existence still today. The crown is what sets them apart. The crown is what raises up the king or the queen and elevates them above their subjects. But David says, I wear the crown of God's loving kindness, and that's what raises me up. And that's what helps us focus on the spiritual blessings of life.